Hello everybody. My name is Akash Thakkar, and this video series is all about using Reaper for game audio. Now, some of you may be wondering how to actually use Reaper specifically for video game sound design, because you may have heard a lot that a lot of sound designers use Reaper specifically for video game sound effects, and rightfully so. It's super good for that. It's in fact basically built for it at this point. It has so many features that are perfect for working in video game sound, which is why it's so popular. Now, if you already know how to use a DAW and it's working great for you, then there's no reason to switch to Reaper. Reaper's not some godlike DAW that's going to make you a great sound designer. But if you are interested in learning it, and if you are interested in speeding up your workflow with sound design, this video series is for you. Now, before we dive in, I'm going to keep 3 things in mind throughout this entire series. Number 1, I'm assuming you already know how to use a DAW a little bit. Maybe you're an advanced DAW user. Great, but I'm assuming you're coming from some other DAW environment already. So maybe you know a little bit about Pro Tools, or maybe you're a master of Pro Tools, or maybe you know Logic inside and out, or maybe you're coming from FL Studio, anything like that. I'm assuming you have some basic digital audio knowledge. So you know what a VST is, you know what a plugin is, you know what a mixer is, you know what an audio track is, you know what MIDI is, those basic things. If you have those basic things down, then you are totally set for this series. Number 2, this series is going to be broken up in such a way that every single video is going to give you a result at the end of it. So you're going to be able to walk away and say, oh, now I know how to do this thing in Reaper. And it's going to be bite-sized and extremely manageable. So you're going to be able to binge this, essentially. So that's the whole point of this. It's going to be more fun, and it's going to be binge-worthy, I hope. And number 3, I'm going to be using the default Reaper theme for this. So we're using Reaper 6 in this series, and we're using the default theme. So if you want to follow along exactly, just make sure you're using the default Reaper theme and you'll be good. If you don't know what I mean by themes, don't worry about it. We'll cover it in another video. And lastly, I'm going to be showing you some workflow tips in Reaper such that you can kind of build your own way of using it. Reaper's upside is that it's ludicrously customizable. If there's something you want to do in it, there's a way to do it. Pretty much guaranteed. So the ways I'm going to be showing you to work aren't the only ways. You're going to be seeing other sound designers on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever, using Reaper in completely different ways than me. I found what works for me extremely quickly, but you may find another workflow for the way you design sound and make music that works better for you, and that's totally okay. So I'm going to be giving you broader strokes that will help you learn from other sound designers as well, because you'll be able to see what they're doing and copy them immediately, because you'll have the basic understanding to know exactly what's going on. Now, in this first video, we're going to be diving into setup, because setup in Reaper is actually really important. So it may seem kind of boring, it may seem kind of slow to go through a DAW tutorial and just like set it up, but honestly, Reaper is probably the program that you need to make sure is set up right before we get into things, because it's so customizable, like I said, that you want to make sure that everything is good to go. And honestly, some of these settings might be already set for you and some of them might not be. So just follow along and we'll dive into it and make sure everything is all set up and good to go. Now, in this series, I'm actually going to be using a setup procedure that's set up by a sound designer named Anne-Sophie Mongeau. She worked on games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and a whole bunch of other stuff at Eidos Montreal and many other things. She wrote a great article about Reaper setup, and I'm basing this video off of her work. So I'm posting her stuff in the description below as well, because she's an amazing sound designer. She's given great talks about Wise and her sound design on games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So I recommend you check her stuff out. Full credit where credit is due. This is based off of Anne-Sophie Mongeau's work. So I highly recommend you check her out. She is an incredible sound designer. So here we are in Reaper, and I want to first show you the project settings. Now, these are the settings that are basically going to go across all of the projects that you're going to be working in. So we're going to start with File and going down to Project Settings right here. And if you're on a PC, this will all be very similar as well. This is both Mac and PC compatible. It looks pretty much the exact same. So here in Project Settings, the first thing I'd recommend you do is go over to Media. And in this Media tab, I'd recommend this path to save media files. making a folder for that. So basically I type in audio. So that means basically when I drag in any audio files, maybe I'm dragging in stuff from my sound library, it will make a folder inside of my project called audio and save them there. It'll copy all those files there instead of using the original files that I'm dragging in. So it'll make copies of every single file that I drag in and save it into this folder named audio. You can call it whatever you want. Just type in something here and it will automatically make that folder for you. So very, very useful, very, very handy. Just make sure that's there because then you'll make sure that all of your stuff is copied in without any issue. Now, if it hasn't been set up already, I recommend that your wave bit depth be set to 24-bit PCM because that's, higher quality, and it's also very, very standard in the game industry to work with 24-bit files. Not all the time, but more often than not, you'll be working with 48K 24-bit files. Now, what we're going to do is save as default project settings. So what that's going to do is make it so that these settings that we just set up are going to apply to every single project that we make from here on out. So just click Save as Default Project Settings. Now, before we go on any further, though, there's something really important I need to do, and that's make a latte. Next, we are going to go to the Reaper preferences. So we're going to go to Reaper in the top left here and click Preferences. And you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff. And I recommend you poke around here because there's a lot here for you to look at. But the first thing you want to look at is paths. Now, this is very useful because you can set where you want things to be saved and where you want things to go by default. So that's very, very handy. But one thing that is recommended that you click on and check is this one called Store All Peak Caches. So basically, whenever you import an audio file into Reaper, it makes a cache of the peak file. So basically, it saves the image, quote unquote, of that peak file, meaning the audio file, so that it can display the waveform of that audio file much, much quicker when you move it around and play with it. So it's basically not redrawing those peaks because it saved that peak file somewhere on your computer. They're very, very small, and it's a good idea to save those and store those because then your project will work a little bit faster. But what I recommend you do is click this box, and you can save it wherever you want. Basically, you want them outside of your project, though. I recommend having them not be in your actual project folder because if they are, they'll just kind of clutter everything up and you'll have a ton of peak files and you don't have really any use for them. You're never going to touch them, but it's nice to have them so that Reaper runs a little bit faster and a little bit smoother. Next up is this section called Device. Now, if you're using an audio interface like I am, you can click which sort of audio output you want here, and you can choose which sample rate you want and all that sort of good stuff. And you can click the audio MIDI setup of your computer and see what's up and check what's going on, all that sort of good stuff. Now, what you can do is change this however you want, and you may want different output and different input devices as well. That may be something that you want. So you may want to play outside of your audio interface, but record using your built-in mic for whatever reason, or vice versa. Whatever it may be, this is an option as well. It says it's not recommended, so maybe don't use it, but in case you want it, it's there. Next up, I recommend you look at the plugins section of this preferences. And I recommend looking into your VST section specifically. So you can see where all your VSTs, your virtual instruments and your plugins and all that sort of good stuff are being scanned. By default, usually this works fine, but in case it isn't, make sure it's pointing to the right folder and you can hit rescan in case you add any more plugins in the future and make sure that that's all set. Now, there are just a couple things to take care of before we finish up this video. So I'm going to hit save and you're going to see a dialog box pop up. I'm actually going to edit this out because you're going to see a bunch of secret projects if I just show you. So let me just hit save and then go somewhere else so you don't see all my secret projects that I'm working on. Okay, so when you hit save, you see a dialog box like this come up. So one thing I recommend you do is you click create subdirectory for project. Now what this does is it makes a folder for that project every single time you save a new one. So it packs it all into a nice folder. It doesn't just leave the files strewn everywhere. So that's really, really nice. Now, also you want to copy all media into project directory. So this is a very useful one as well, because again, when you're importing audio into your project, it's going to copy it instead of just using the raw files, the raw originals. You're going to actually be copying the audio files that you're using, just so that you are working with copies of those files. And if you take that project folder and move it elsewhere, it's going to work just fine because it's copying those files, not moving them or not working with the originals. It's keeping them all in the same folder. So that's really, really, really important. So make sure that create subdirectory for project and copy all media into project directory is all checked, and your projects will be a lot cleaner and you can move them from computer to computer without too much issue. And lastly, before we dive into actually using Reaper in future videos, you need to know about something called actions. Now, actions are what Reaper calls hotkeys. So they call them actions instead of hotkeys or shortcuts. But if you go to actions and go to show action list, you'll see all of these actions here. Now, by default, Reaper doesn't have a lot of actions mapped. It's kind of up to you to map these and make them actually work for you. So what you're going to need to do is actually go through and make sure that you have actions set up for things that you're going to do on the regular. But don't worry, this video series is actually going to go through a bunch of actions that are going to be very, very important to you, and making custom actions as well that will help you work in Reaper super, super fast. So the stuff that we're going to be using as game audio people, as game audio designers, isn't by default mapped to any keyboard command. But don't worry, in future videos, we are going to get to that. It's going to be no problem. Now, speaking of actions, before we wrap up, there's one last thing to cover. There are things called SWS. Now, these are extensions that basically give more capability to Reaper for free. So you can download what are known as the SWS extensions and then work with those as well and have some really, really, really cool actions that you can work with that Reaper doesn't come with by default. So if you go to the SWS Extensions website that I've linked in the description below, you'll be able to download them. But just so you can see what the website looks like, here they are. So you can download these for whatever operating system you're using, and they work incredibly, incredibly well and give you a lot of custom features within Reaper that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Okay, that's it for today. That's it for the setup. That's all we need to do. And then we're going to be able to dive into Reaper in every single video and learn a cool new thing every single time. If you found this video helpful, then sign up for my newsletter where I share tons of tips on how to become a full-time game audio person in the industry, whether you're a sound designer, whether you're a composer, voice actor, whatever it may be. If you want to make a living doing game audio, then this newsletter is for you. It's the biggest game audio community in the entire world by many, many orders of magnitude. I read every single email that I get from y'all, and it's absolutely amazing to see all the positive support I'm getting. So if you like this video, of course, do the whole subscribe and thumbs up thing, all the YouTube stuff, and sign up for that newsletter because you also get 2 free courses that teach you how to make a living in game audio, from networking to finding a gig to actually negotiating with clients really, really quickly. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.